Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Tremendous Testicles with me, your host, Danny B. My God, Henry, they're mad as hell and they're not gonna take it anymore. These words, uttered by Nixon in 1972, have been the great fear of those in power since human societies first settled down. Revolts and resistance, reforms and change have always taken place within human cultures. It's part of the human condition. But when a society en masse stands up and says, no, we will not accept the unacceptable, give me liberty or give me death, it can shake the resolve of even emperors. When Nixon said this to our dear friend Henry Kissinger in 1972, in the White House, surrounded by school buses that protesters were trying to break through, the situation would be very different from the one we're going to discuss today. For as much as we like to bemoan the United States as an imperialist power that cares nothing for the human rights of its people, they were never going to order the military or police to fire upon the crowd. They did once at Penn State University, and that ended US involvement in the Vietnam War in a day. The people were not prepared to see their own civilian population shot to guarantee their involvement in a war. But what if they had? What if they had faced an opponent in Nixon that was willing not only to shoot them, but to shoot their entire families and to go to the towns that they were from and kill every single man, woman and child and animal, to cover the land in salt, to tear down the houses and homes, to tear down the churches? What then? Would people have still protested in 1972? Would we still protest today for what we protest for if that's what we faced? Because that's what our protagonist, our hero today, will be up against. Many of you may have heard the term or name Britannia before, perhaps Britannica from the Encyclopedia Britannica for my educated peeps out there, but the context in which you have heard the term is unimportant, so long as you recognise the image of a fair maiden, armed and armoured, with a lion at her feet and a British flag in her hands. This is Britannica, and if you have seen this, then you have seen an image of our protagonist and hero today, Bouddica, who after her death would become embodied as a goddess and worshipped even by those she slaughtered in her lifetime. But why? Why was she so famous? Why was she so fearsome and formidable as to become a goddess? And why does any of this qualify as material for Tremendous Testicles? Ancient history is a gold mine for us here at Tremendous Testicles, and it's because it's a weird parallel to our own timeline. People have a tendency to view the rise of human society from the poverty of hunter-gatherer life to settling to slowly rising up the steps of civilization. But I don't like to look at history like that. I look at it much more as a constant stopping and starting of a machine that rises to the heights of civilization before falling over again. And in the current timeline that we'll be discussing in today's episode, it's 60 years after the death of Christ. The Roman Empire is at its zenith. It rules territory from the deserts of Iran to the mountains of the Scottish border, from the misty forests of Germany to the Altai mountains in Morocco. Rome will never be as powerful as it is now. And as for our protagonists' people, the Celts, this will be the last chapter of that people. This will be the last time that their story is ever heard. In the first episode of Tremendous Testicles, on the unexpected G, Caius Marius, we spoke of the Cimbrian Teutons, who were cousins of these Celtic people that we'll be discussing today. Now these Cimbrian Teutons had come down from the mists of the north and smashed into the Romans in Italy. And let's not forget that they smashed into them. They defeated 4 Roman armies in the field. That doesn't happen. They were terrifyingly different, ferocious in battle. They had grey eyes and grey hair. They would have appeared to the Romans as aliens. At this point in the story, in this parallel timeline we're discussing, the aliens have not just been defeated by Gaius Marius and his Romans in Italy. No, that's not enough for the Romans. The Romans were not happy to leave an alien people on their border that could descend upon them at any time in the numbers that they did. So in the intervening years between the victory of Gaius Marius, around 100 BC, and the rise of Bouddica, some 160 years or so later, the European world in which these two people had inhabited had changed drastically. The Romans had gone from a rising and formidable power to the ancient world's equivalent to the United States. They were the uni-power. There was no one that came close to challenging the military might and the economic ability that the Romans had. In this 160-year period, the Romans had expanded north chasing these aliens, these Celts, these Germans, from place to place, from hold to hold. First through southern France, then through the rest of France, or Gaul as they called it, parts of Germany and Belgium, before finally reaching the last bastion of Celtic culture in Europe, the home of Bouddica, the British Isles, or as the Romans would call it, Albion. Shout out to my Fable fans, by the way, if anyone else remembers that, just saying. The expansion of Roman power is weird, because it is genocidal, in a way. It's not genocidal in the same way that the Nazis were, in so much as if you were not what they deemed acceptable, we're just going to kill you. We're just going to kill you like rats. The way that the Romans looked at it is that if you're prepared to abandon your entire culture, it's like if someone walked into Western civilization today and said, stop wearing jeans, stop wearing t-shirts, stop listening to the music that you're listening to, come live how we live, wear our clothes, act how we act, join our army, come fight for us, and we'll be cool. We'll be cool. So lots of Celtic tribes had Romanized, had become like them. The alternative was terrifying. And this is where Bouddica, today's bad bitch, comes into frame. To understand where they fit into the Roman world and the Mediterranean world in general, we have to look at their history. Mediterranean people, including the ancient Greeks, had known about Britain for some time. Traders had been going back and forth out the Straits of Gibraltar for at least 1,000 years to get access to British tin. Now tin, when combined with copper, makes bronze, and until the discovery of iron, bronze was the most powerful cutty stuff that people had, which made trade with Britain very important, but it was always mysterious and terrifying to the settled people of the Mediterranean. It was a dark and misty place, and think about how we romanticize Britain and ancient British culture today. We talk about druids and Stonehenge and black magic and human sacrifice. When the Romans were trading and going to ancient Britain, all of this stuff was happening. They weren't stories, they weren't myths, they weren't legends, it was real and it was happening on the daily. And Romans believed in this shit. They did. Whereas many of the continental Celtic people, Gauls, parts of Germany, parts of the Balkans today, where they had abandoned many of these practices, Bouddica's Celts had not. Judaic culture was still incredibly powerful in Britain, and human sacrifice was still common. Perhaps one of the most interesting things to us today about the Celts, their conceptualization of gender. I know it's a hot button topic in today's age with things like the Me Too movement and feminism in general. I'm going to tell you a little story about a beautiful woman and her husband. The woman was called Ciamora, and her husband, who arguably has one of the coolest names ever, was Ortyagon. Ciamora and Ortyagon belonged to the Galatian Celts, and the Galatian Celts lived in modern-day Turkey. I don't know why, they just decided to chill out there. Maybe it was a good holiday spot. Sometime before, well, in between Caius Marius and Bouddica, the Romans had conquered this part of the world and had conquered the Galatian Celts. Now, Ciamora was a noblewoman. She wasn't a queen, quite, but she was a very important person within her tribe, and she was captured by a centurion, which is sort of like a Roman officer. Now, this centurion had raped her and taken her money and done all these horrible things to her. He seemed to think it was a good idea to go and sell her back to her husband afterwards, like he wouldn't do anything. And he actually didn't. The centurion went and met her husband, Ortyagon. They had an agreement of honor between each other that we'll make this deal and I'll give you some gold and you give me my wife back and everything will be fine. Ortyagon kept his part of the deal, but Ciamora was not going to let that shit slide. No. Because Ciamora was also a bad bitch, so what does Ciamora do? As soon as she's freed, she walks up to her husband, pulls out his longsword, walks back to the centurion and cuts his head off. And her husband says, Ciamora, what are you doing? I made a deal. And she turns around and says to him, it is more important to me that one less man is alive that has slept with me than your honor. And you've got to understand how shocking this was to Mediterranean people. Amongst Germanic and Celtic people, there was a fair degree of gender equality, and I don't want the audience to get wound up in this new age of idealism about Celtic culture. Celtic armies were not a 50-50 split between these berserker Hulk men that looked perfect and these beautiful shield maidens. That's delusional. Women's opinions were not exactly considered equal within Celtic society. At the same time, no tribe could go to war without the permission of women. Even if women were not really allowed to give counsel on tactics or how wars should be fought, a tribe couldn't start a war without permission of their woman. Is this true equality as we would envision it today? No, it's not. But if you compare it to the Greeks or the Romans of the time, to them it was culture shock. They couldn't even understand how they could treat women as their equals. And not only this, but women had a weird central place in Celtic religion. The Celts had this idea that there were two parallel universes, and when you died in one, you went to the other. And because women gave birth, they guarded this gateway. So nearly all major religious ceremonies in Celtic culture were done by women with the assistance of a druid. It's a mixed scale of gender equality within Celtic culture, because at the same time, men still held the power of life and death over their wives. So Ortaigon could have killed Kiamora, but from the sounds of things, Kiamora could stand up for herself, so I don't think Ortaigon was going to risk that. It's not all glitter tits and rainbows, but it's not all oppression either. It's one of the most interesting gender spectrums to study. And it would be into this world and culture that Bouddica would be born into about 30 years after the death of Christ. Allegedly. This last bastion was under siege on all fronts, politically, socially, culturally, and religiously. For much like later colonial powers, or arguably even the United States today, much of Rome's imperium was not born or maintained purely by conquest and martial might. Much of the heavy lifting was done by the fruits of civilization, running water, heated floors, a stable currency, social welfare networks, a police force and courts. All of these had done wonders when it came to Rome's ability to assimilate barbarian people and to bring them in and make them Roman. It was a deal that many tribes had taken. Bend the knee or die was the offer that Rome gave, and Iceni, Bouddica's tribe, had agreed some years before to bend the knee. Prasutaigos, it's a tricky name I know, Prasutaigos, had been the High King of the Iceni, England's modern-day Norfolk, for many years, and had reigned over a tumultuous period in British history. The Romans, under Emperor Claudius in 43 AD, had invaded the British Isles in full force. Julius Caesar had come before, but that was more of a raid, more of an expedition. He just wanted to check shit out, see how the spot was. It was a smooth spot. There was a lot of things popping off. He said he'd come back. He got caught up with Cleopatra, had to sling some dick on the Nile. These things happen. Moral of the story is, the Roman Empire had always been eager on Britain, but Britain was a very tough and scary place to get to. By this time in history, 50-ish AD, the Romans had a considerable foothold in southeast England, the areas around London and Kent today. Prasutaigos, in hopes of maintaining this arrangement that they'd made with the Romans, they'd worked with the Romans to defeat some other tribes, hoping to maintain their sovereignty. He'd willed his kingdom at his death to 3 people. One was the new emperor of Rome, Nero, soon to be the Mad Emperor, and the other 2 were his daughters that had been born through Bouddica, and it would be under her regency that they would be raised, and that under her regency Iceni sovereignty would be respected. And it was in this dark hour of grief and loss at the death of Prasutaigos that Bouddica would for the first time had the mantle of leadership placed upon her. When Roman tax collectors would fall upon her kingdom like vultures to get the last scraps of meat from a carcass, it would be her duty to defend what was left of her people. And it is here that our sources diverge, because there's 2 main sources we're leaning on here, beautiful people, in case you want to look up the story for yourself. On the one hand, Tactius, who is one of the greatest of all Roman historians, and whose father would fight Bouddica himself, argues that the reason why was due to her husband's debts, and he owed people a bunch of money. Rome needed its cash, baby. Rome was a big pimp, and pimps need money, if you didn't know. Our other source is Mr. Cassius Dio, who I'm going to run with because his story's way sexier and I think his name's cooler. The Romans had at this time pretty much wiped out all resistance left in Britain. All the tribes had bent the knee and accepted the deal of Romanization. The last place left was the island of Anglesey off the north coast of Wales. This was the home of the Druidic religion for all Celtic people, even those on the mainland. When the Romans went there, they killed all of them. They burnt everything to the ground, the sacred groves that had stood for thousands of years. They pulled down the stones, but when they did, something interesting had happened. All of the druids had lined up on the shoreline when the Romans approached and doused themselves in oil. And when the Romans finally got within range, they lit themselves on fire, a huge human sacrifice. And Romans at the time speculated what was to come with the Iceni and Bouddica was British black magic, the last gasp of Judaic power, to summon forth the British people in one last throw of the dice, and one last attempt to secure their freedom. As these last Druids were being slaughtered, Cassius Dio tells us that a greedy governor had come to Britain and was seeking to exploit the last wealth out of these people. Bouddica, as a regent and as a woman, with 2 daughters who were the next to be in line, the Romans looked at them as a weak target because in Roman culture all property was passed along the patriarchal line. She actually had no right to inheritance because the emperor had been included in the will. Females have no property rights, and there's a male included, it must go to him. So thus the Romans were just coming and taking what they were owed. But Bouddica, being a bad bitch, she was having none of that. And the power of this ancient Judaic religion was about to have itself manifested in the very darkest of ways in Bouddica's life. For she, naturally being a bad bitch, was not about to stand back and let her people that had been willed under her mantle of protection to be exploited. She would not let it happen. So she stood up to the Roman tax collectors and said, "No, we are not defeated, we are not a conquered people. You will not come in here and take what is ours." And the Romans, being Roman, don't take resistance lightly. They get her daughters, they get her. They bring them to a room, they tie them all up together, and Bouddica is tortured and raped as she watches her daughters raped in front of her. You don't need to have kids, or to be a woman, to think about that and what must have been going through her head during that experience. Now, we've talked about the Judaic religion and human sacrifices and curses and what these people believed in, and just try and imagine for a second the pure blackness that must have been in her heart at that moment as she decided revenge would need to be sought for this. I can't even fathom the hate that must be born in someone's heart to watch your children raped in front of you by people laughing at you, and you're a high queen. So Bouddica survives this. Her daughters survive this harrowing experience, but they are clearly changed forever by it. The details of what happens next are unclear, because our sources unfortunately are damn near exclusively Roman. However, Bouddica would travel the breadth and width of her kingdom, telling the story of her and her family's humiliation at the hands of the Romans, and declaring to her menfolk, "Would you let this happen to your nobility? Would you let your queen and your princesses be raped and stand back and do nothing?" And the men are shook. They are so shook that word begins to spread amongst all the free tribes left in Britain of what's happened to Bouddica and her daughters, and not one of them can stand for it. Now it's here that we get our first description of Bouddica and what she looks like, and this comes from Cassius Dio. Most Roman historians are not eager to give praise to women. It's something you need to understand, and it's unfortunate about history, but unfortunately the Romans were not a big fan of bitches. Sorry ladies. Here is how Cassius describes her, and I think it tells us a lot about how formidable she must have been. She was tall, with tawny hair hanging down below her waist. Her voice was harsh, and her glare stared through men. And after invoking her menfolk, the menfolk of the Iceni, to war, she travels to her neighbouring tribes, those that would still risk war against Rome, the Trinovantes, the Brigantes, the Dumnonii, all rallied beneath her banners, and she would make one last desperate gamble for the independence and dignity of her people, because that is what had been taken. You must remember that the ancient Celts were a very proud warrior race, and the Iceni were never defeated in battle. Her husband had died and had made a deal with Rome, and Rome had sullied that deal. It was for this that the Britons would fight, their last hope of honour and independence. Now, I know I have discussed before what Bouddica was invoking by deciding to go to war against the Romans, but I don't think it can be emphasized enough how much the Romans must have been like the Empire from Star Wars to her. When you saw the Romans coming over the hill, you know what you heard in your fucking head? Da 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 da. That's what they were up against. The Romans even had a word for it. It's called Bella Romanum, the Roman way of war. We've discussed it before, but again, we're not just going to kill you. We're not just going to kill your family. We're going to kill everything, and we're going to turn the land into a desert. So Bouddica as an educated noblewoman, must have known the risk she was taking, but after what she had been through, she had no scribbles left to give. She gathered up her host of the free tribes and marched on her first target, which I will attempt to pronounce, but the English name is Colchester today, or as the Romans would have called it, Camelodona. We're just going to call it Colchester, people, okay? The Romans had some tricky names every now and again. I'm doing my fucking best here. Now, Colchester, which had formerly been a Celtic British town, had since become a colonia for retired Roman legionaries and their families. It's how Rome took over the world, essentially. They'd conquer an area, make some friends, the guys would retire, settle down there, marry some locals, bada bing, bada boom. Within 2 generations, you've got Romans. The army under her command would have been at least 60,000 at this point. To oppose them at Colchester, there were 4 cohorts of the 9th Legion. That's about 2,500 men, and they were all killed. That's how angry these Celts were. They had been smashed time and time again by Roman armies, but at this battle, they fell upon them like demons and tore them apart. The Romans were just not prepared for this number of people with this level of anger and this level of preparedness to die. So Colchester would burn to the ground in a day, and they would kill every single man, woman and child. They did not take slaves, they did not leave children, they killed everything. That's how great their desire for vengeance was, and it was a fury goaded by their queen. After this army would march on Londinium, which, to all my bright cookies out there, have probably already guessed is London today. And they burned this to the ground too, after another short battle with half a legion that just wasn't prepared for what came. The firestorm that Bouddica and her men created in London was so powerful you can still find traces of it today, 2,000 years later. If you dig down 8 feet in central London, you'll start finding red clay. That's all that's left of the city that the Romans built and Bouddica burned. The greatest Roman city in Britain and centre of their power is gone. Colchester is gone. Between them, nearly 80,000 Roman citizens have died. The 9th Legion lies smashed. If our story ended here, it would be a happy story for Bouddica. Bouddica would have saved her people, her culture and her island from foreign incursion and invasion. She would have avenged the stain on her and her family's honour and inflicted it upon the Roman filth tenfold. She would have secured the future of her daughters as High Queens of the Britons, and all on a tremendous gamble. That gamble was that numbers and courage, knowing the land and the righteousness of their cause, would be sufficient to give them a shot against Darth Vader and his empire. An ominous, all-conquering machine like empire that consumed all in its path. And the fate of her cause would be found at a location as legendary as it is mysterious today, Watling Street. Watling Street, as we call it today, is a Roman road that runs through Britain. What was left of the Roman forces in Britain, which comprised of the 14th and 20th legions, would retreat up this road and find a good location to fight Bouddica and by this point her massive army. And this battle of Watling Street, where Bouddica and her cause would find their fate, offers me, your host, a chance to do 2 of my favourite things. Venerate suicidal bravery, always fun, and metaphorically jerk off at the awesomeness of the Roman military machine, the Legion. Let's think for a moment, if we may, how Bouddica must have felt at this point. Her spirits must have been high. She must have achieved what she set out to do. She'd broken all Roman forces that had come before her. She'd burnt their major centres of power. Nero himself was starting to question whether or not Rome could sustain its outposts in Britain. All the other chiefs of the other tribes had come to bend a knee before her. She was a bad bitch and she knew it. And in front of her laid the final obstacle on her path to freedom and glory. The remnants of the 14th and 20th legions of Rome under Praetor Gaius Suetonius Polinius, some 10,000 men, give or take a few, blocked the road at Watling Street and finally, after weeks of retreat from London, had decided to turn around and make a stand. Now, Cassius Dio and Tactius debate the numbers of Bouddica's army at this point, the last free army of the free tribes of the British Isles. But I'll go with the number of Tactius because it's smaller, and even though it's smaller, it's still 100,000 fighting men, Cassius Dio says it's 250. It doesn't matter what number you want to believe, it must have been vast. The Romans only had 10,000. Bouddica must have felt like her victory was just a matter of fact. It was the last thing to tick off the box. Let's remember that we're fighting against Darth Vader and the Stormtroopers here, and Suetonius was a seasoned commander. And moreover, he was a bad motherfucker in his own right. He picked his ground well, a low rolling hill leading into a forest with valleys on either side. The only way Bouddica's boys could attack would be head on. Instead of facing disordered and panicked legionaries as they had outside of Colchester and London, they would face the 14th and 20th legions who had been there waiting for 2 days for this battle. I said before I'd get a chance to jerk off at how cool the Romans were, and the Roman army at this point was near the pinnacle of its capability. Legionaries were full-time professionals that signed up for 20 years of service as a full-time job in return for land and citizenship. Men of the legions at this battle would have come from places as far away as modern-day Iraq, Germany, Italy, and Spain, but they were all Roman and all trained and deadly killers. They would have been equipped from head to toe in metal plate and chainmail. Except for the feet, because Roman boys need those sexy sandals, you know, we all rock the sandals, it's alright. They would have been equipped with heavy throwing spears, a large rectangular shield, and the gladius, the short Roman sword that would build an empire upon its point. These men were like walking tanks that had been trained for war since adolescence. And against them, in a head-on assault, would come the Celtic British warriors. Armed with a large but much more flimsy shield, wielding a long sword and a spear, and often naked or near naked, painting themselves blue to show their disdain for death and their opponents. Whilst a wild charge of the Celts might have been a formidable thing, as had been shown at the gates of Colchester, to break a prepared legion would require something different. So Bouddica, feeling victory in her grasp, would give her final speech to her host, and the only time her words are recorded and given to us directly. And these words come from Tactius, whose father was there. Her final speech would not be as a wronged aristocrat, protecting her wealth, nor as a woman raped and seeking vengeance, but as an ordinary person seeking justice. She said, "It is not as a woman descended from noble ancestry, but as one of the people that I am avenging lost freedom. My scourged body, the outraged chastity of my daughters, Roman lust has gone too far. Not even age or virginity are left unpolluted. But heaven is on the side of the righteous vengeance. A legion which dared to fight has perished. The rest are hiding now in that camp, or are thinking anxiously of flight. They will not sustain even the din and the shout of so many thousands, much less our charge and our blows. If you weigh well the strength of the armies and the causes of the war, you will see that in this battle you must conquer or die. This is a woman's resolve. As for men, they may live and be slaves."
Oh shit, son. Damn.
And what does this tell you? She was goading her men, saying, "I'm willing to stand and die. Why the fuck aren't you?" This is why I love Bouddica. She is the first feminist to stand up and say, "I don't give a single fuck. Not one fuck do I have left to give." And can you blame her after what she's been through? But that is why she is so powerful. She doesn't just tell people to do things, she does it herself. Now against this, we have the speech of Suetonius Polinius, handed again to us by Tactius. Against the powerful emotive speech of Bouddica's, what we get is much more run-of-the-mill. It's shop talk, people, but it's pretty telling of what's about to happen. Suetonius Polinius says to his assembled troops, "Ignore the racket made by these savages. There are more women than men in their ranks. They are not soldiers. They're not even properly equipped. We've beaten them before, and when they see our weapons and feel our spirit, they'll crack. They always crack. Stick together, throw the javelins, then push forward. Knock them down with your shields and finish them off with the swords. Forget about plunder. Just win and you'll have everything." I struggle to imagine what must have been going through Bouddica's head that morning before the Battle of Watling Street. To wake that sunrise and to think that you have victory in your grasp. All hopes in front of you. There is a future for your people. This is the last hurdle that you must overcome on a road of many hurdles that you have already overcome. This is the last battle, and so you send your people forward. It's hard for us today to imagine what ancient battles would have looked like, although it is immensely fascinating to try. What Bouddica must have seen in that first hour would have broken her heart. She sent the Celts forward, and a sickening clash of metal against flesh would have come to her as thousands of javelins rained upon her barely armed warriors. Breaking their charge, men would have been screaming at agony, giant metal rods coming out of them, and they're still alive. I mean, people can live through these things for hours. And the brave and young would have kept hurling themselves forward, surging through this horror show of men mangled upon javelins into the Roman ranks. And the front ranks of the Roman legion cut them to pieces. These were men that had trained for 20 years how to fight, that did it every day against people who were undoubtedly brave and undoubtedly skilled, but stood no chance against the military machine of the Romans. They were cut to pieces by gladii forged in the blast furnaces of Ravenna. The horns and bugles sounded, and the Roman formation shifted into a giant wedge. Now the Roman wedge formation is like a giant set of serrated teeth. This rolling metal machine advanced forward, killing everyone in their path and leaving mangled gore behind them. It was so bad that Roman sandals were designed with nails in them, so they could stand no matter how much blood or filth or gore was underneath them. And within a few hours, this massive army, 100,000, broke. It broke upon Roman lines like water upon rock, and when the Romans counterattacked, the slaughter was total. Light infantry and courage stands no chance against professional heavy infantry, especially against the best heavy infantry humanity has ever produced. Bouddica must have seen this. She must have felt her heart break. All of the testicular fortitude it must have taken to risk it all on one gamble for your people, to bring others under your banner and to come so close, only to feel it fall away before you. How could she have ever hoped to break the legions of Rome? She couldn't have. But the courage to do so, against what was coming, against Darth Vader and stormtroopers, makes her truly deserving as equal among none of tremendous testicles of history. Her army would be annihilated in the field to a man, and Bella Romanum, Roman way of war, would be brought against her people, the Iceni. All her work for freedom would be undone. The British would not rise again until the Romans would leave some 350 years later in 410 AD. Bouddica herself, her body was never found. Her fate is unknown even today. It's fun, and I like to think after all the hell she had to go through, that hopefully she escaped somewhere with her daughters, and got to live out her final days in the peace they had always hoped for. Tacitus tells us a different story. That she killed herself by poison on the field of battle, and had her bodyguards burn her like the heathen kings of old, ensuring her body would never be defiled again, and she could take her place amongst the pantheon of gods of Britannica. She herself would become embodied as Britannica, goddess of victory and patron god of all those who resided in the British Isles, the mother of all. And I know this is a bit different for Tremendous Testicles. Tremendous Testicles so far has been all about victories. The standing up against total odds and still winning. Bouddica's cause did end in total failure, but even today she is remembered in form and in symbol, and perhaps that is the greatest victory of all, to live forever in the hearts and minds of men millennia after you and your people are gone. And that's why Bouddica is a bad bitch.
Oh!